after the so-called retaliatory strike by Iran on the American military base in Qatar, deserted base from which military equipment and personnel had been evacuated in advance, following an Iranian warning, US President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire in the 12-day Israeli-Iranian war. Both the Israeli government and the Iranian leadership have already agreed to this ceasefire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made corresponding statements. Thus, it can be said that the conflict, if not completely over, is at least close to being resolved. Although even after Donald Trump's announcement, both sides continued to exchange fear attacks that were quite serious and destructive for both Israel and Iran. Naturally, the question arises, were the United States and Israel able to achieve the goals they set for themselves at the start of this operation, namely the destruction of Iran's nuclear program? Donald Trump insists that after the United States intervened in Israel's military operation, these goals were indeed achieved. He also debates with those American media outlets that fear Iran has retained its nuclear arsenal, or at least a large stockpile of enriched uranium. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also says that the operation was brought to its logical conclusion. However, is Iran truly completely deprived of its stockpiles of enriched uranium? Whether it is truly deprived of the ability to continue work on producing nuclear weapons after this Israeli operation is quite difficult to say at this point. As is known, during the days of the operation, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke about the importance of rising up against the Iranian regime. US President Donald Trump also spoke about the possibility of a different regime in Iran. However, it can now be stated that the Iranian regime has maintained its position in the country. But as for its nuclear potential, that will be a major question in the near future. And only when we understand, if we do understand whether Iran has truly lost its nuclear potential, will we be able to talk about the real results of this 20-day war. At this point, it can be said that both countries, Israel and Iran, have realized the dangers of a war of attrition. And when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaks not only about the nuclear, but also the ballistic threat from Iran, he is, of course, referring to the attacks that Israel has faced over the past 12 days. Iran, of course, has also realized that it cannot control its own airspace and that its military facilities and government residences are easy targets for the Israeli Air Force, not to mention the intervention of the Americans. Thus, objectively, both Jerusalem and Tehran need, if not complete silence, then at least a pause in this war. And Donald Trump was able to take advantage of this to force both sides into a ceasefire. In a situation where the actions of the American president himself began to be criticized by many of his own supporters, who, after the American strike on Iranian targets, started to fear that Donald Trump, contrary to his own promises, was dragging the United States into a new endless war in the Middle East. And from this point of view, of course, it is important for Donald Trump that this endless war not be endless, but rather last only 12 days. Even if we don't actually know whether the United States and Israel have managed to accomplish their main objective and deprive Iran of the ability to produce nuclear weapons. So we can say that the main events in the Middle East related to Iran's nuclear program are still ahead of us. And this also needs to be understood. Israel has demonstrated its ability to strike Iran, to eliminate its political and military leaders, and to destroy its strategic facilities. But Iran has also demonstrated that it is capable of striking the territory of the Jewish state itself. And from this perspective, it poses a significant threat to its security and to the stability of the entire Middle East. It is obvious that such conclusions will also be drawn by the leadership of the Arab states, who closely observed this conflict and were even forced to close their own airspace in preparation for possible Iranian strikes on American military facilities in the region. On the other hand, for Ukraine, it is quite important that Israel, thanks to its attacks, was able to destroy Iran's military potential. And now, Iran will definitely not be in a position to help the Russian Federation in its war against Ukraine. Although it is obvious that Russia is now producing all those drones and missiles itself, which it may have turned to Iran for during the initial stage of the war, when the Russian army lacked its own capacity to continue combat operations. Weakening Iran as an ally of Russia also undermines the position of the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. All the more so because Putin firmly refused to provide any military technical assistance to Iran, and the visit of that country's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, to the Russian capital, where Araghchi brought Putin a letter from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, requesting greater support, only demonstrated the limited resources Russia has to help its allies. And thus, this war has indirectly demonstrated that Russia cannot lay claim to the role of a global power in the modern world. And from this point of view, to compete with the United States, which Donald Trump reminded us of when debating with former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who began talking about the possibility of transferring nuclear weapons to Iran and other countries, is simply out of the question for Russia. He received a response from the American president and immediately began to apologize and backtrack. So this is also quite an important point in this complicated story, reminding us that thanks to Ukrainian resistance, Russia has fewer and fewer global opportunities. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe, follow me on social media, and check out Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatella channels supporting this resource. Use the sponsorship feature on YouTube. Victory and peace.